Imagine standing on the low, flat plain between two rivers, feeling the ground rise and fall with the breath of water and wind. The Euphrates and the Tigris run like the lifeblood of the land, their channels carving paths through clay and reed, and together they make a place where life can be both abundant and precarious. In that mixture of mud and moisture, people first learned to turn wild growth into food that could be stored and shared, and with that simple change something remarkable began. The slow, steady work of tending fields by the riverbanks set in motion a transformation that would reshape human life for millennia. To understand how villages became cities, begin with the small decisions of everyday people: where to plant, when to harvest, how to repair a dike after spring floods. Those decisions were practical and urgent, but they also required cooperation, and cooperation meant conversation, rules, and memory. Sharing tasks led to specialization. Some grew grain, others tended flocks, some mended nets while others made pottery, and that specialization began to create more complex social arrangements. As tasks multiplied, so did the need to keep track of what belonged to whom, and the first tools of administration were born out of necessity. The land itself nudged communities in a particular direction. Annual floods deposited fine silt and made the fields fertile, but they also arrived with violence and unpredictability that had to be managed. People learned to build embankments and channels, to time their sowing to the rise and fall of the rivers, and to store grain for lean years. These engineering efforts required coordinated labor, planning, and leadership, and along the banks of the great rivers small clustered settlements began to look outward, not just inward, toward larger shared projects. From those projects came a new scale of human organization, villages cooperating to irrigate fields, defend against floods, and move surplus goods to new places. Surplus is a word with power in this story. When a harvest produced more grain than a household needed for the next season, choices multiplied. Surplus could be consumed in feasts or redistributed to bolster alliances, used to pay workers or purchase raw materials, or stored against future uncertainty. That stored abundance allowed some people to devote time to activities other than food production, crafting finer pottery, weaving cloth, shaping metals, or trading. Over generations, surplus underwrote a division of labor that fed artisans, priests, and administrators, and a landscape of social roles began to emerge. Those social roles slowly crystallized into institutions. At the heart of early Mesopotamian settlements stood buildings that were more than houses: temples, storerooms, and platforms of authority. Temples were places of ritual, but they were also hubs of economy and bureaucracy, where offerings were counted, loans were recorded, and grain was distributed in seasonally timed allotments. Priests and temple managers kept lists and devised routines for redistributing resources, giving them a practical power that mirrored the spiritual authority they claimed. These centers stitched the community into a network of obligations and rights, a fabric in which individual households were interwoven with communal goals. As centers of administration grew, so did the need for reliable records. The story of writing begins not with literature but with accounting. Clay tokens and early markings were used to represent quantities of grain, livestock, or craft goods, and they provided a visual memory for transactions that would otherwise be forgotten. Over time, marks evolved into signs pressed into wet clay, and those signs became increasingly abstract and versatile. What began as a counting system unfolded into a tool for law, diplomacy, poetry, and myth, and the ability to inscribe information transformed how communities remembered their dealings and imagined their future. Imagine a young scribe in training, a slender reed stylus gripped between cautious fingers, pressing wedge-shaped marks into a soft tablet in a dim room warmed by the smell of baked clay and barley. The schoolroom was a place of discipline and repetition, where memorized lists of commodities and administrative formulas laid the foundation for more complex texts. Scribes learned to record not only grain allocations but also legal agreements, genealogies, and the hourly rhythms of temple life. Training scribes was a public investment. As literacy spread within administrative circles, it multiplied the capacity of a state to plan, tax, and coordinate. The material world of Mesopotamia shaped technique as much as necessity did. Mud brick taught builders how to stack and compress, reed mats and wooden beams taught them how to span space without stone, and bitumen sealed jars, boats, and roofs against moisture. Potters turned the rich clay into durable vessels that could hold oil, grain, or wine, while weavers made the textiles that clothed bodies and reinforced social status. The wheel changed transport and craft. The pottery wheel accelerated production while wheeled vehicles transformed long-distance exchange, drawing caravans across dusty tracks and pushing goods toward markets in distant cities. With improved transport and craft came wider networks of exchange. Mesopotamian communities were not isolated islands. They were nodes in a growing web that connected mountain miners, coastal traders, and distant farmers. Lapis lazuli arrived from Afghanistan, tin from Anatolia, cedar from Lebanon, and these materials crossed hundreds of miles through intermediary hands before reaching a palace or shrine. Trade was both economic and cultural. Objects carried with them technologies and ideas, and the needs of distant markets shaped local production and even agricultural choices. As trade intensified, wealth concentrated in new hands and public places acquired greater importance. Temples became treasuries, palaces stored plunder and tribute, and rulers claimed the right to allocate resources in the name of order and defense. The figure of a leader, whether temple official, assembly elder, or emergent war chief, began to appear in the archaeological record and in the slow evolution of social memory. Once centralized leadership took form, cities could marshal labor for grander constructions, defend profitable routes, and sponsor long-distance expeditions that increased both wealth and complexity. The first cities in southern Mesopotamia were startling in their novelty: compact spaces of dense dwellings, monumental platforms, and public courts where strangers could meet and negotiate. Uruk, Eridu, and later Ur became centers of craft, worship, and administration, places where farmers, artisans, traders, and priests crossed paths. Urban life concentrated people who had previously lived dispersed across the plain, and that concentration changed habits. Crowds required new rules for traffic, sanitation, and dispute resolution, and the fact of proximity accelerated cultural exchange and innovation. Urban life also brought inequality into sharper focus. Not everyone prospered in a city. While some managed wealth and status, many labored in routine tasks for modest reward. Wage labor and dependent households became fixtures, and social obligations were enforced by debt, service, or law. The elite used monumental architecture and ritual to assert legitimacy, while the mass of residents found stability in routine, kinship networks, and the rhythms of market days. These tensions, between private accumulation and public duty, between tradition and change, became recurring themes in Mesopotamian history. Religion and ritual were woven into the fabric of city life in ways that were both practical and existential. Gods were imagined as having control over rivers, crops, fertility, and the fortunes of kings, and temples were places to negotiate favor. Festivals punctuated the year and bound communities together in processions, offerings, and shared feasts, while daily rites maintained the spiritual economy of the city. Religious language also provided a vocabulary for social order. Divine mandates justified leadership, sacrificial protocols defined property boundaries, and ritual calendars organized labor and seasonal work. Architecture expressed both belief and power. Ziggurats rose like man-made mountains, stepped towers of mud brick that lifted shrines closer to the sky and created a vertical center for processions and observation. Palaces sprawled with courtyards and administrative rooms, their walls painted with scenes that celebrated conquest, harvest, and divine favor. Streets wound between tightly packed dwellings, and courtyards provided private space for family life and craft work. The built environment made visible the hierarchy of the city. From public terraces to private roofs, every level carried different functions and served different social groups. As cities matured, they developed more formalized political structures to manage affairs. Assemblies of elders, councils of notables, and eventually rulers with recognized authority presided over disputes, allocated land, and led in war. Leadership styles varied. Some ruled through ritual and priestly office, others through military command or hereditary succession, but all needed legitimacy, whether sourced from tradition, religious sanction, or successful administration. The interplay between local councils and centralized authority shaped the governance of city-states, producing patterns that would influence later empires. War and diplomacy were natural extensions of urban competition and ambition. Cities defended territory and sought tribute, and sometimes they invaded neighbors to secure resources or strategic advantage. Fortifications, chariots, and organized infantry became part of military evolution, and bands of mercenaries and conscripted labor reinforced city defenses. At the same time, marriage alliances, treaties, and trade pacts created lines of cooperation that could be as enduring as conflict itself. Warfare and diplomacy coexisted, and both demanded administration, communication, and record-keeping, further incentives for writing and bureaucracy. The economy of Mesopotamian cities blended household production with state-controlled redistribution in a pattern scholars sometimes call the temple household model. Homes sustained basic production through gardens, small livestock, and craft workshops, while temples and palaces coordinated larger projects like irrigation maintenance and long-distance exchange. Taxation and corvée labor linked private households to public needs. Households gave grain, labor, or manufactured goods in return for protection, access to irrigation, and market opportunities. This interdependence meant that political stability depended not only on force but on continuous economic flows and the perception of fairness in distribution. Population growth accompanied urbanization and created new social dynamics. Higher densities allowed for more specialized trades, metalworkers who refined copper into alloyed bronze, scribes who managed complex accounts, physicians and midwives who developed medical knowledge. Children learned trades from parents or masters in workshops, and apprenticeship systems transmitted skills across generations. With denser populations came new public health challenges, such as contamination of water sources and diseases transmitted by fleas or rodents, and communities responded with rudimentary sanitation measures and local regulations. Craftsmanship became a visible badge of identity for cities, with certain places gaining fame for specific goods. One city might be renowned for its textiles, another for fine ceramics, and yet another for metalwork or stone carving. Guild-like structures and family traditions preserved techniques and maintained quality, and skilled craftspeople traveled to meet demand elsewhere. Luxury goods served a dual purpose. There were material comfort for elites and gifts of diplomacy, objects that forged alliances and testified to a city's links in the wider world. The development of technology in Mesopotamia was incremental yet profound. The simple plow, improved irrigation canals, the harnessing of animal labor for traction, and the adoption of the potter's wheel all multiplied productivity in ways that added up over generations. Metallurgy advanced from native copper to bronze through alloying with tin, enabling stronger tools and weapons. The tracking of time, dividing months by lunar cycles and days into hours, allowed planners to coordinate agricultural activities, religious festivals, and civic labor with greater precision. Mathematics and astronomy, practical at root, flourished in this context of administration and ritual. Counting systems were adapted for accounting and land measurement, and rough geometry served surveyors who resolved boundary disputes after floods shifted landscapes. Astronomical observations informed calendars and religious schedules, and the predictable paths of stars helped sailors and traders orient themselves on long journeys. This blend of practical calculation and cosmic wonder anchored daily life to both mundane needs and broader cosmological order. Language in Mesopotamia was a living tapestry. Sumerian, with its unique grammar, was the language of some of the earliest cities, and later Akkadian, a Semitic tongue, spread through diplomacy and conquest. Bilingualism and language contact enriched diplomatic texts, religious hymns, and legal records, and scribes often worked in multiple languages. Poets and priests composed myths and epics, stories of creation, flood, and heroism that circulated in temples and palaces and that gave people a shared narrative for understanding their world. One of the most enduring narratives to emerge was a story about a great flood, a memory encoded in myth, possibly reflecting actual episodes of catastrophic inundation that reshaped communities. Such memories were folded into religious teaching and political rhetoric, providing moral lessons and a reminder of the precariousness of human life before the rivers. Narratives about gods who created cities, who bestowed kingship, or who tested humanity's resolve helped justify social structures and offered consolation when disasters struck. Myths served as both instruction and identity, binding communities with a common past and a shared destiny. Law emerged as a tool for stabilizing social relations and managing conflict in urban communities where anonymity and proximity increased friction. Early legal codes dealt with property, debt, personal injury, and family matters, setting norms for compensation and responsibility. The need to make decisions predictable in trade and in disputes created a culture of written agreements and public proclamations. Legal practice did not simply punish, it prescribed procedures for restitution, protection of dependents, and the regulation of economic interactions, and its development was intimately tied to the existence of centralized urban institutions. Everyday houses in Mesopotamian cities reflected a balance of private life and public interaction. Courtyards provided light and ventilation and were places for small workshops, storage, and the tethering of animals. Kitchens, which often sat off the courtyard, smelled of simmering stews and dried dates, and communal ovens might serve several households. Floors were compacted clay or brick, and walls bore the soot of lamps. In winter, families huddled together for warmth, and in summer they climbed onto flat roofs for sleep under stars. Food customs themselves were a point of social meaning. Bread, beer, and stews formed the staples, and beer in particular was a social lubricant and calorie-rich beverage consumed by all ages. Festivals transformed everyday food into ritual feasts where the city's abundance was displayed and redistributed, reinforcing social bonds. Dietary differences also marked status. The wealthy enjoyed meat and imported spices more often, while the poor relied more heavily on pulses, grains, and seasonal vegetables. Gender roles in Mesopotamia were complex and varied by social status and occupation. Women worked in households, managed estates, spun and wove textiles, and some held positions in temples as priestesses or managers of economic activity. Elite women could own property, sign contracts, and exercise influence through family networks, while lower-status women labored in fields or workshops. The archaeological and textual record shows that female agency existed, though it was framed within a patriarchal structure that shaped inheritance and public power. Childhood and education were shaped by family expectations and economic needs. Sons of scribes or craftsmen often followed the path of their fathers, trained in writing or a trade, while daughters learned household skills that could contribute to family income. Formal schooling was limited, But apprenticeship was widespread, and the transmission of knowledge depended on hands-on practice as much as on texts. Children participated in seasonal labor, festivals, and domestic tasks, learning the rhythms of community life through observation and routine labor. Disease and death were constant companions, and funerary customs reveal how communities coped with loss and memory. Graves contained objects that reflected the deceased's status and role, and shared burial practices linked families across generations. Priests performed rituals to honor the dead and to ensure favorable treatment by ancestors and gods, and the concern for continuity extended to legal provisions for property and lineage. Life and death were tightly bound in social practice, and both were embedded in the material and symbolic world of the cities. The environment was not static. Over time, the intensification of irrigation and cultivation altered soils and salinity levels, challenging agricultural productivity. Salt accumulation in fields could reduce yields, and farmers adapted by changing crops, fallowing fields, or investing in deeper drainage. Climate fluctuations and shifts in precipitation affected river regimes and could trigger migrations or conflict. These environmental stresses required flexibility and sometimes prompted technological or social innovation, but they also exposed the fragility of complex urban systems dependent on stable agricultural surplus. Migration and movement were constants in Mesopotamian history. Seasonal laborers, traders, refugees, and skilled artisans moved between villages and cities, bringing new skills and ideas. Cities relied on a steady influx of resources and people to maintain labor demands, and this mobility created cosmopolitan mixes of languages and customs. The movement of people could be stimulated by opportunity or forced by displacement, and those movements reshaped demographics, labor markets, and cultural practices in profound ways. The relationship between city and countryside was reciprocal and sometimes tense. Urban centers depended on rural produce and raw materials, while rural populations relied on city markets and protection. Land ownership and water rights were perpetual sources of negotiation, and patterns of tenancy and debt could bind rural households to urban interests. Yet there were also cultural flows outwards. Urban religious practices, fashion, and pottery styles influenced village life, creating a shared cultural horizon across the plain. Over centuries, the balance of power among cities shifted repeatedly. Some rose to prominence through religious prestige or trade advantages, while others fell due to war, environmental degradation, or economic decline. Conquest and assimilation brought languages and administrative practices from one region into another, and the ebb and flow of dominance left a complex stratigraphy in the archaeological record. These shifts remind us that cities were not fixed monuments but dynamic organisms that adapted, reinvented, and sometimes collapsed. One of the most significant transformations was the emergence of territorial states from networks of city-states. Where once independent urban centers negotiated through kinship and mutual interest, rulers began to imagine and enforce broader domains. Kings towered as figures who claimed control over multiple cities and their resources, projecting power through inscriptions, monumental building, and the redistribution of spoils. Yet the administration of a larger polity demanded more sophisticated record-keeping, bureaucracy, and a political vocabulary of legitimacy. The evolution of law and administration created a profound literary culture. Royal inscriptions proclaimed building works and military victories, hymns celebrated gods and kings, laments recorded disasters and begged restoration. Storytelling had a civic role, instructing citizens in ideal behavior, creating a shared past, and celebrating the return of order after chaos. The written word sanctified memory and anchored social expectations, ensuring that hopes, legal precedents, and religious dogma could be transmitted with extraordinary fidelity. The role of memory in Mesopotamian civilization cannot be overstated. Libraries of clay tablets accumulated in palaces and temples, preserving administrative records, literary compositions, and scholarly texts. These collections were not mere archives, they were active repositories of knowledge used for governance, ritual planning, and education. The survival of texts across generations allowed intellectual continuity, enabling later scholars to consult older legal models, astronomical observations, or mythic narratives when making decisions. Science and scholarship took root in the practical needs of administration and ritual but matured into an intellectual tradition. Astronomers charted planetary movements, creating tables and predictive models. Mathematicians refined numerical systems for land measurement and commerce. Medical practitioners compiled remedies and diagnostic formulas. Knowledge circulated in teacher-student lineages, sometimes bundled into compendia, and it served both the utilitarian needs of the state and the contemplations of scholars who probed the order of the heavens and the structure of society. Trade routes expanded beyond immediate neighbors, and maritime and overland corridors linked Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean, the Iranian Plateau, and the Indus Valley. Ships hugged coasts and sailed river mouths, while caravans traversed mountain passes, creating exchange networks that spanned continents. The goods that moved along these routes, metals, timber, precious stones, textiles, were not just commodities but carriers of social relations, gifts, tribute, and symbols of alliance. Commercial diplomacy became as important as military campaigns in securing access to resources and markets. Cultural exchange accelerated through these ties, affecting art, religion, and technology. Iconographic motifs traveled with merchants and officials, and artistic styles blended foreign influences with local traditions. Religious concepts migrated too, with gods and cultic practices sometimes absorbed or reinterpreted in new communities. Over time, cosmopolitan cities absorbed this diversity, producing hybrid forms that reflected their connections to distant peoples and distant lands. The spectacle of ceremony, coronation rituals, temple festivals, royal processions, served political and religious ends by staging legitimacy in public. Such performances displayed the ruler's relationship to the divine and underscored the order of the polity. Crowds witnessed the redistribution of wealth during festivals, reinforcing civic identity and the social contract between rulers and subjects. Pageantry functioned as both theater and governance, shaping memory and consolidating authority in visible, ceremonial acts. Women of elite households sometimes commanded influence through patronage and property, building religious institutions or endowing scholarly endeavors. Queens and priestesses appear in records as patrons of temples and guardians of economic resources, and their roles demonstrate that rulership included more than martial prowess. Networks of marriage created alliances that could stabilize or destabilize power, and women's households were nodes in broader political strategies. Their contributions were woven into the political economy of the city, often behind the scenes but no less consequential. Education and knowledge production were gendered yet varied in practice. While most scribal positions were dominated by men, women sometimes received training in literacy, particularly when they served in temple administrations. Education included arithmetic, ritual formulas, legal practice, and literary traditions, preparing individuals for roles in administration and culture. The production of knowledge was thus a collaborative effort involving multiple social strata, institutions, and gendered practices. Artisans and artistic production achieved remarkable sophistication, marrying form and function in objects that ranged from simple household wares to intricately carved seals and inlays. Cylinder seals, small engraved stones rolled across wet clay, served as signatures and works of art that encoded identity, mythic scenes, and contractual authority. Such objects were portable, personal, and powerful, linking a single hand to a broader administrative and symbolic system. The quality of craftsmanship indicates specialized training and aesthetic values that prized both technique and symbolic meaning. Seals and inscriptions were practical tools of administration, but they also conveyed narratives and beliefs. A seal might portray a scene of a god granting kingship or a hunt that symbolized martial virtue, and the bearer of the seal became a living node in a chain of authority validated by text and image. These artifacts allowed individuals to authenticate transactions and to carry a visual biography of identity and status wherever they traveled, providing continuity in a world of shifting alliances and markets. The urban landscape was policed by norms, officials, and sometimes by physical bounds. Markets had schedules and regulations, certain crafts were restricted to particular neighborhoods, and public order relied on the visible presence of authority figures who mediated disputes. Punishments for theft or fraud were designed to be restorative and deterrent, and public proclamations reinforced social expectations. The complexity of city life required a continuous negotiation between freedom and control, and urban governance evolved accordingly. As centuries passed, innovations accumulated into traditions that future empires would adopt and adapt. The administrative templates created in the cities of southern Mesopotamia informed governance in broader territorial states, and their legal, economic, and writing systems provided a durable infrastructure for successive polities. Even as political centers shifted and new dynasties arose, the institutional memory embedded in texts and practice ensured a continuity of knowledge and technique across generations and regimes. The archaeological record gives us glimpses of daily patterns: siege storage pits, clay tablets with lists of rations, the tilt of a loom, the scorch marks of a kitchen hearth. Together, these traces reconstruct a world of embodied labor and communal rhythms, where seasons, festivals, and market days structured the year. The physical remains tell a story of adaptation and invention, a layered narrative of people who negotiated risk and reward with practical ingenuity. That record also speaks to the ordinary: children playing with toy carts, market vendors calling their wares, a baker turning out loaves before dawn, and these human details bridge millennia. Long-term environmental pressures and political upheavals periodically reconfigured the map of settlement, yet cultural forms endured. Languages shifted, capitals moved, and new religious emphases gained prominence, but the core achievements of irrigation, writing, urban planning, and craftsmanship persisted. These continuities show that the transition from village to city produced durable institutions that could be retooled for different political agendas and ecological conditions. Survival depended on the adaptability of both technology and social organization. The legacy of early Mesopotamian cities extends far beyond their chronological bounds. They invented systemic ways of managing surplus, of recording transactions, and of imagining political legitimacy that would resonate across the ancient world. Concepts like codified law, written contracts, specialized bureaucracies, and urban religious centers became templates that informed later civilizations in the Near East and beyond. The cognitive tools, writing, mathematics, and formalized ritual shaped human capacity to plan and remember on unprecedented scales. Listening to their story, we can follow the logic of incremental change: simple agricultural decisions leading to irrigation projects, surplus leading to specialization, specialization leading to craft and administration requiring writing and law. Each development did not replace what came before but built upon it, creating a layered civilization where innovations accumulated. Cities were not spontaneous eruptions, they were long-grown organisms cultivated by generations of practical choices and imaginative solutions to the constraints of their environment. To picture the city at night is to imagine 1,000 households clustered close together, the glow of oil lamps and hearth fires illuminating narrow streets, and the distant silhouette of a ziggurat against the starry sky. Stories were recited, offerings made to household spirits, and merchants secured their goods in storerooms. The murmur of voices, the clink of pottery, and the creak of carts settling in their stalls formed a nocturnal chorus that blended the sacred and the profane in a continuous human presence. The transition from village to city also entailed the expansion of human imagination. People had to think in new terms, about public works that stretched beyond a single king group, about property rights that extended across generations, and about distant relationships mediated by writing and exchange. Those mental leaps made possible ambitious projects and complex institutions, and they required trust mechanisms such as seals, witnesses, and recorded contracts to operate effectively. The cognitive infrastructure that supported urban life became as crucial as the physical walls and canals. The accumulation of transport and administrative technologies altered how time was perceived. Calendars, record books, and annals introduced a sense of linear sequence and public memory that transcended oral tradition. Year names tied to particular events, building a temple, defeating a foe, experiencing a flood, created communal markers of time, and that chronological awareness enabled planning on a scale unimaginable to dispersed villagers. Thus the city became not only a spatial cluster but a temporal framework for collective action. Stories of individual lives, like a potter's careful shaping or a reed cutter's return from the marshes, reveal how urban complexity rested on countless modest labors. The hands that turned the wheel, that repaired the canal, that scribed the tablet, and that tended the hearth all contributed to a mosaic of interdependence. Cities magnified human capacities by clustering these labors, allowing a single artisan to support a class of administrators, priests, and soldiers. The story of civilization is therefore inseparable from the story of labor, and with labor comes both dignity and exploitation. The rhetorical language of kingship, inscribed on steels and cylinder seals, shaped public perception of power and achievement. Monumental inscriptions proclaimed victories, documented building programs, and linked rulers to gods. This act of publicizing accomplishments served to legitimize rulership and to establish an official narrative of the city's past. Such narratives were not simply vanity, they strengthened civic cohesion and offered models of conduct to be emulated by successors and subjects alike. The crafts and techniques perfected in Mesopotamian cities influenced later traditions in neighboring regions. Their methods of brickmaking, canal construction, and administrative practice provided tested solutions that others could adopt. In this way, Mesopotamian urbanism acted as a source of practical knowledge disseminated through traders, migrants, and conquerors. The diffusion of these techniques demonstrates how civilization is not bounded by geography but is a networked process of learning and borrowing. Religion continued to adapt within the urban framework, absorbing new deities and reinterpreting old ones as cities integrated diverse populations. Temples could become cosmopolitan centers where rituals from different places were performed side by side, and syncretism became a hallmark of urban religiosity. Religious specialists negotiated orthodoxy and innovation, balancing tradition with the needs of an increasingly pluralistic populace. This dynamism allowed religious practice to remain relevant to changing social and political realities. The role of literacy expanded as economies and polities grew more complex. Where once tablets recorded straightforward rations, now archival libraries preserved treaties, administrative reforms, and scholarly commentaries. Literacy was partly a tool of governance but also a medium of cultural continuity. Myths and literary forms were copied and reshaped, and readers across generations engaged with a common repertoire of texts. The persistence of written culture provided a thread of continuity through times of instability and change. Urban economies evolved multilayered markets that served local consumption and international exchange. Markets were arenas of negotiation where prices reflected scarcity, quality, and reputation, and market days were social events where news, ideas, and fashion circulated alongside goods. The existence of these vibrant marketplaces made cities lively centers of interaction, where anonymity and intimacy combined to produce dynamic social relations. Economies thus balanced the practicalities of supply and demand with the symbolic value of exchange. Cities also became centers of legal and medical knowledge. Physicians developed empirical recipes and surgical techniques, while legal practitioners accumulated precedents and procedural knowledge. Both domains benefited from writing, which allowed for the compilation of casebooks and therapeutic lists that could be consulted and transmitted. These bodies of knowledge enhanced the capacity of cities to address human suffering and social conflict with increasingly sophisticated tools. Monumental architecture continued to symbolize communal investment. Building a temple or a defensive wall was an act of public will, consuming labor, resources, and civic energy. Such projects reinforced solidarity and provided employment, while also paying homage to gods and ancestors. The physical remains of these projects are the archaeological evidence of collective ambition and communal identity, and they speak to a desire to make permanence out of fleeting human efforts. In times of crisis, city structures proved both resilient and vulnerable. Famine, war, or ecological decline could precipitate social unrest, but cities often had mechanisms to cope: grain reserves, alliances, and reserves of administrative expertise. Conversely, the same centralization that allowed cities to mobilize resources could also concentrate failure when systems broke down, leading to rapid declines. The balance between flexibility and rigidity shaped the outcomes of crises, and responses varied according to local leadership and resource endowments. The interplay of memory and innovation characterized how cities navigated new challenges. Officials consulted old texts for legal precedents, engineers adapted known canal plans to new conditions, and religious leaders reinterpreted rituals to suit changing circumstances. Thus, the past served as a resource rather than a constraint, and the ability to both preserve and adapt cultural forms was crucial to urban longevity. This dialectic between continuity and change is part of the deep lesson of Mesopotamian urbanism. As modern listeners, we can appreciate how ordinary sensory details, mud under fingernails, the smell of wet reed, the sound of a stylus on clay, animate this distant world. Those details remind us that monumental history is made of small experiences repeated day after day: the taste of bread, the trust in a neighbor, the tension of a negotiated price. The accumulation of tiny acts of care and calculation is what built canals, recorded contracts, and raised ziggurats. Civilization is the aggregated result of human habits practiced at scale. Mesopotamian urbanization also produced an ethic of record and repair. When floods carved away a field, people rebuilt channels, rewrote boundary lists, and adjusted their expectations. When new rulers arrived, they often preserved older systems and adapted them to new political orders rather than discarding them outright. This pragmatic conservatism, preserving what worked and modifying what didn't, enabled cities to survive turbulent eras and to pass on institutional knowledge across centuries. Cities encouraged a degree of reflection and abstraction that fueled intellectual life. Philosophical and ethical considerations found expression in proverbs, hymns, and legal maxims that guided behavior and contemplated the God's will. This reflective tendency contributed to developments in law, cosmology, and literature, and produced texts that wrestled with justice, fate, and human aspiration. Such literary products show that urban life spurred both practical administration and profound thought. The expansion of bureaucratic techniques affected personal identity as well as governance. People were recorded in lists, associated with particular households, grafted into legal documents, and recognized by seals, creating a sense of identity that was both personal and public. Legal status, free, dependent, or slave, was inscribed in transaction texts and affected daily choices and opportunities. These inscriptions of identity created social expectations and regulated interactions, shaping life in visible and invisible ways. Over generations, the city became a stage where private ambitions and public duties intersected. Merchants sought profit, priests sought favor, rulers sought legacy, and households sought stability. These motivations coexisted uneasily but productively, generating the impetus for public projects, legal reform, and cultural patronage. Cities thus became crucibles of human intention, where competing aims were negotiated and sometimes synthesized into civic policy. Language, ritual, law, and craft together formed a matrix that enabled cities to function as ordered communities rather than mobs. Rules and rituals normalized behavior, scripts communicated agreements, temples provided social services, and crafts met material needs. The combined effect was to make large-scale human cooperation feasible in a way it had not been in smaller, dispersed communities. The city was not merely a concentration of people but an architecture of coordination. Even as empires rose and fell, the idea of the city persisted as an organizing principle for human society. Urban life offered opportunities for innovation, cultural flourishing, and economic development that villages could not easily provide. Yet cities also demanded adaptation, compromise, and a constant negotiation between public order and private life. The ancient Mesopotamian experience demonstrates that urbanism is less a single invention than an evolving practice built from countless local decisions and innovations. In the end, the story from villages to cities in Mesopotamia is less about sudden revolution and more about a long accretion of human ingenuity. Farmers who learned to herd water with canals set the stage for administrators who learned to herd information with tablets, and in that transfer of competence lay the seed of civilization. The processes that created the first cities were gradual, cumulative, and often fragile, but they produced institutions and ideas whose influence outlived empires and shaped how people think about governance, law, and community. To listen to this history is to appreciate how ordinary needs, food, shelter, protection, and meaning can give rise to extraordinary institutions. Mesopotamian cities formed around those needs, and through them people cultivated new forms of social life, centralized administration, written memory, specialized labor, and monumental architecture. These were responses to environmental and social challenges that required collective planning, record-keeping, and shared belief, and they changed what it meant to be human in a world of interdependence. As you imagine the plain between the rivers, think of human hands shaping canals, shaping clay tablets, and shaping lives in the shadow of ziggurats. Think of conversations exchanged across courtyards, bargains struck at dawn markets, and prayers whispered into festival nights. This is the world that gave the first cities their texture, a world of mud and reed, of light and shadow, of repetitive labor and inspired invention, and its legacies underpin many aspects of modern social life. The long arc of Mesopotamian urbanism offers lessons for any society that seeks to create and sustain shared institutions. It teaches the importance of record-keeping and transparent procedures, of public investment in infrastructure, of balancing central authority with local autonomy, and of preserving knowledge across generations. It also warns of environmental limits and the social stresses of inequality, showing that technological success does not guarantee sustainable or equitable outcomes. These lessons are neither prescriptive nor exhaustive, but they emerge from a deep historical experience of building collective life. Finally, the story from villages to cities is a human story of adaptation, creativity, and resilience. It is a tale of people who turned unpredictability into plans, who translated memory into marks on clay, and who organized themselves into complex communities capable of achievement and cruelty alike. By listening, we inherit not just facts about brick and canal, but an understanding of how cooperation, imagination, and record can transform societies. The birth of Mesopotamian civilization is, in that sense, an enduring example of how ordinary human efforts can yield extraordinary social forms. Long before maps stretched into neat borders and before kings commanded nations by radio and proclamation, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers was alive with the slow, patient labor of people shaping water and soil. The rivers carved a corridor of fertility through a dry world, leaving behind silt and promise, and the first cities rose like oases of human design. Habit formed into habit, and habit grew into institutions that would, in time, be called civilization. The heartbeat of that cradle was measured in seasons, offerings, and the steady return of grain to storehouses under sloped roofs. Those early cities were called by names that still taste of antiquity when spoken: Uruk, Uar, Kish, Lagash, Nippur. Each city claimed its own patron god and its own destiny, and none were content to remain merely places of habitation. There were sanctuaries, marketplaces, workshops, and nerve centers of politics and piety. The city-state was both community and cosmos, a microcosm where human lives mirrored the perceived order of heaven and earth. Listen to the hum of those streets in your mind: clay walls baking under sun, donkeys laden with reeds, fishermen calling from shallow boats, and the clatter of potters shaping amphorae. Craftsmen tuned their tools against the rhythm of trade, turning copper and later bronze into blades and tools that would change the density of labor. Artisans stamped tokens and seals, and those impressions would evolve into the first written marks, the slow scratchings that would one day be called cuneiform. The idea of gods in Sumer was not distant or abstract. The divine was immediate and managerial. Gods were patrons of things: the god of the wind, the goddess of fertility, the lord of the sweet waters. They owned the city and its people in a spiritual sense, and their temples owned the land in a very real, legal sense. Priesthoods became administrators of resources, mediators of law, and directors of labor for temple projects that reshaped the physical world. Ziggurats rose like stepped mountains at the city center, platforms of mud brick that reached toward the sky as if to shorten the distance between heaven and earth. There were not tombs but mountain thrones, stages where priests enacted rituals to sustain cosmic harmony. Their terraces caught light at dawn and saturated the surroundings in shadow in the late afternoon, marking the day with architecture as much as with song. From them, ritual and administration were inseparable, because supplying the temples demanded grain, canals, and a ledger full of names. Kingship in Sumer often wore two faces, one as manager of earthly affairs, and the other as steward or chosen agent of the gods. Some rulers called themselves shepherds or ensi, caretakers of their city under divine mandate. Others later assumed titles suggesting broader command, titles that hinted at military prowess and political consolidation. Whether priest king or warrior lord, each figure had to answer the twin needs of wall and field, of defense and irrigation. Irrigation was the lifeblood of these city-states, and it required coordination on a scale that forced communities to organize beyond family lines. Canals diverted floods and spread fertility, but they also demanded labor, planning, and dispute resolution. When water flowed evenly, the harvest fed many. When it failed or was mismanaged, the noise of petitioners at the gate became a constant. Thus, the management of water created an administrative core that theorized law and built the earliest bureaucracies. Out of those bureaucracies came writing, not for the sake of abstraction but for the simple and urgent need to remember who owed what to whom. Clay tablets soaked of impressions recorded rations, contracts, and temple inventories. The wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform began as pictographs and smoothed into syllables, a system that could flex from accounting to poetry. Once thoughts could be fixed in clay, memory grew dependable, and institutions could plan for eras longer than a single lifetime. With writing came the possibility of literature, and the first great stories reached for immortality in different ways. Tales gathered around figures who were part ruler, part myth, like Gilgamesh, a king whose legend became a meditation on friendship, mortality, and the desire to be remembered. These narratives were sung, inscribed, and copied in temple schools, and in their lines one can hear the anxieties of a world where empires rose and fell like the seasonal flood. The epic tradition served both as entertainment and as a repository of cultural values. Among the most remarkable of ancient voices was a woman named Enheduanna, a priestess and poet who signed her own hymns and declared a personal place in history. Her works combined devotion with political intent, praising gods and legitimizing the authority of a ruler through the soft power of verse. Enheduanna's inscriptions reveal a society where literary skill could serve governance, where poetry and policy braided together. Her authorship reminds us that scribes and priestesses were not merely recorders but shapers of public sentiment. Power in Sumer was seldom static. City-states contended with one another for control of trade routes, fertile land, and prestige. Alliances formed and dissolved on the same tides as the rivers, and occasional raiders pressed into hinterlands to extract resources. The clash of chariots would come later. In these centuries, foot soldiers and boats determined the outcomes of many skirmishes. Cities that maintained walls and a steady supply of grain could survive sieges, those that could not were subsumed or abandoned. In the midst of this competition, an ambitious figure from beyond the southern city-states would change the scale of politics, a man we now know as Sargon of Akkad. He rose from an origin story thick with later myth, a cupbearer who rose to found an empire, but the fact of his military and administrative acumen remains clear. Sargon united a swath of territories previously fragmented into city-states and created a polity that stretched the idea of kingship into an empire. His reign marks a turning point when power ceased to be merely local and began to centralize in new ways. Sargon's empire introduced new administrative practices that had to reconcile the traditions of Sumerian cities with the language and governance styles of the north. Akkadian, a Semitic tongue, spread alongside Sumerian, and the two languages coexisted in a bilingual elite. Bureaucracy matured, governors, standardized weights, royal inscriptions, and a postal system of sorts enabled messages to travel across vast terrains. This machinery of governance made it feasible to extract tribute and mobilize labor on scales the Sumerians had only occasionally imagined. At the heart of imperial rule was not only the sword but also the symbol of divine mandate. Rulers claimed that their conquests were sanctioned by the gods, and they built temples to demonstrate their piety and secure the loyalty of subjugated cities. They appropriated local cults and married themselves ceremonially to goddesses of fertility and land, thereby enfolding conquered peoples into a shared religious language. In this way, empire was as much a matter of belief as it was of bureaucracy. The Akkadian period accelerated cultural exchange. Craftsmen traveled, potters adopted motifs from distant towns, and metalworkers refined alloying techniques that emphasized the growing importance of bronze. Trade networks extended east toward the Iranian plateau, west toward the Mediterranean, and south into regions that supplied timber and precious stones. Such exchange created both wealth and vulnerability, for to protect trade was to invite competition and contested control. Urban life in these cities contained contrasts that made them lively and precarious. Marketplaces could be crowded and loud, with traders bargaining over barley and lapis lazuli, and courtyards could ring with the laughter of children. Yet disease, fire, and famine were constant threats, and planners built walls because the alternative was often ruin. Mortality rates were high, but cultural continuity persisted through rituals and the writing of names on clay that might survive the centuries. Every household was shaped by a social fabric that wove together artisans, priests, scribes, and farmers. Slavery existed in various forms, sometimes as war captives and other times as debt bondage, but it was not the defining trait of social life. Kinship and patronage networks mattered deeply. Women held roles as wives, mothers, priestesses, and occasionally as landowners or business operators. Their legal rights were mediated through contracts and legal codes, and those documents remind us that everyday life was regulated by explicit terms. Laws themselves began to be written in ways that made justice legible and predictable, and while the famous Code of Hammurabi came later, earlier justice was already evolving through recorded judgments and customary practice. Disputes over water rights, marriage contracts, and theft were common, and judges settled matters with reference to precedent and community norms. When law becomes a written thing, it changes how people plan their lives. A contract inscribed in clay meant that promises had tangible consequences. Religious ritual continued to thread through civic life like a steady lullaby. Festivals marked the cycle of planting and harvest, invoking gods for rain and fertility, and processions carried statues of divinities through city streets to bless fields and invoke protection. These public ceremonies reinforced social cohesion and reaffirmed the relationship between ruler, priest, and populace. Religion was both reassurance and regulatory system, an ordered narrative that explained misfortune and prescribed remedies. Temples were more than places of worship, they were centers of production, education, and distribution. Grain was stored and redistributed, crafts were produced under temple auspices, and scribal schools trained the next generation of administrators. The image of the temple as a civic hub dissolves any neat division between sacred and secular. Both spheres supported each other. In many respects, the temple acted as the primary economic unit for city-state life. Music and the arts flourished in tandem with these institutions. Harpists, singers, and lyre players performed in palaces and cultic gatherings, their music preserving rhythm and memory for communal identity. Artisans carved reliefs and inlaid precious materials into decorative items that signaled status and devotion. Whether a votive plaque or a monumental stele, the aesthetic choices communicated lineage, power, and religious sentiment. Language itself was a battleground and bridge. Sumerian, a language isolate, persisted as a language of ritual and learning even as Akkadian became the lingua franca of diplomacy and royal court. Scribes learned both scripts, and the ability to read and write conferred social mobility and influence. As each language carried its own cosmology, bilingual documents reveal how ideas were translated and transformed across cultural lines. The Akkadian rulers adopted many Sumerian cultural forms while also imprinting their own identity on public works and inscriptions. Royal inscriptions broadcast achievements in conquest, temple foundation, and law, crafting a narrative of order imposed upon a chaotic world. In doing so, rulers in Akkad were not merely continuers but innovators, synthesizing administrative techniques with symbolic gestures aimed at legitimizing centralized power. Every carved monument was a testimony to the craft of persuasion that sustained imperial governance. Military technology and tactics evolved in this milieu. Fortifications changed to meet new threats, and states organized disciplined forces to patrol borders and protect trade. Bronze weapons and composite bows increased lethality and range, while naval capabilities on the rivers allowed for troop movements that blurred the lines between land and water warfare. Logistics, food supply, shelter, and communication became as decisive as tactics on the battlefield. Yet empires, even those forged by the most formidable leaders, proved fragile before the slow pressures of environment and upheaval. Soil salinization from irrigation practices reduced agricultural yields over generations, and periodic droughts could push fragile systems toward collapse. Cities were not self-sustaining machines. Their prosperity required constant maintenance of canals and social rituals that bound communities to shared endeavors. When canals silted or social compacts frayed, the consequences were swift and often irreversible. Internal dissent and external incursions both played roles in the fragmentation of early empires. Vassal rulers chafed under tribute demands, and rival centers sought to reclaim autonomy. Nomadic incursions from the steppe or mountain peoples could be destructive, but often they also created new opportunities for exchange and cultural synthesis. The ebb and flow of power left a patchwork of states that would, in time, be reassembled by new actors who learned from old models. From the ruins of Akkadian centralization came a period of reasserted local power, and later dynasties rose in places like Ur, enacting their own visions of kingship and piety. The third dynasty of Ur, often called Ur3, attempted a new kind of centralization that tightened control over land and labor through temple and palace institutions. It was a high watermark of bureaucratic refinement, recorded distributions, detailed census-like lists, and sprawling public works that reconnected cities to the irrigational backbone. This era also witnessed renewed patronage of the arts and letters. Schools trained scribes in standardized curricula, royal families commissioned grand palaces and funerary architecture, and the written word was used to inscribe both devotion and dominion. With administrative sophistication came an intensification of state capacity for mobilizing labor and resources. Yet that same capacity required constant reinforcement through ritual and material offerings. The king remained at the center, a symbolic and practical linchpin of order. Across these centuries, the religious landscape adapted as new gods rose in prominence and older cults were reshaped. Syncretism allowed local deities to be absorbed into broader pantheons, often with reinterpreted myths that aligned with royal agendas. Priestly lineages preserved ritual forms while accommodating new political realities, ensuring that religion could be both conservative and flexible. This malleability is one reason why Mesopotamian religious forms could influence later cultures long after their cities had been abandoned. Trade networks, ever outward-reaching, connected Mesopotamia with Anatolia, the Levant, the Iranian Plateau, and the Indus region. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, timber from the Levant, and metals from Anatolia flowed into the cities of Sumer and Akkad, exchanged for textiles, grain, and silver. These networks created cosmopolitan pockets and ports and caravan hubs where men and women of different tongues bartered, married, and exchanged ideas. The circulation of goods fostered a corresponding circulation of myths, technical knowledge, and administrative practices. Craft specialization grew more refined as economies matured. Metallurgists learned to alloy copper with tin to produce bronze that held an edge and resisted deformation. Potteries developed regional styles that could signal origin as clearly as dialect. Skilled laborers became essential to the functioning of palaces and temples, and their expertise was often recorded on the same tablets that tracked rations and labor days. The economy was thus a tapestry of skilled hands, institutional demand, and raw natural endowments. The daily rhythms of life often converged in rituals of food and community. Meals could be simple but ritualized, with bread and beer as staples bound by laws and customs. Hospitality mattered, guests received offerings, and sacred feasts functioned as political theater where alliances were sealed and statuses reaffirmed. Food was sustenance and symbol, a tangible expression of social bonds and reciprocity. Grief and death were confronted with ritual that ranged from private lamentation to public monuments. Burial practices varied across region and time, from chambered tombs to modest graves, but the concern with honoring the dead remained constant. Funerary goods, inscriptions, and commemorative practices aimed to secure a form of memory that linked the living to the ancestors. In remembering, people reinforced their claim to land and lineage. Medicine and healing mixed empirical observation with religious practice, for illnesses could be interpreted as divine displeasure or demonic agency. Healers prescribed herbal treatments and performed exorcisms, while incantations accompanied physical remedies to address both body and spirit. Clinics were not separate from cultic spaces. Sanctuaries often doubled as places of last resort for the afflicted. Such blending of practical and spiritual remedies is familiar in human history because it addresses the whole person. Astronomy and timekeeping emerged out of necessity for agriculture and ritual. Priests charted the cycles of the moon and the sun to determine planting seasons and festival dates, creating a celestial calendar that served both practical and liturgical ends. Observations of eclipses and planetary movements were recorded, sometimes with an air of foreboding and sometimes with measured curiosity. The heavens were both a clock and a text to be read for divine will. Education was shaped by the needs of the bureaucracy and the temple. Boys, and occasionally girls, who trained as scribes learned to impress styluses into clay, copying lists, hymns, and legal formulas. Scribes were the elite technicians of memory. Their craft insulated lines of authority and ensured continuity across generations. To control writing was to control narrative, and that control conferred power. Architecture displayed both utility and symbolic intent. Residential quarters clustered near crafts neighborhoods, while citadels and palaces occupied defensible or prominent ground. Mud brick answered well to local materials, and builders developed techniques to bake and interlock bricks to resist time and flood. Decorative facades, glazed tiles, and sculpted reliefs communicated wealth and piety in ways that spoke to both neighbors and posterity. Economic rhythms were synchronized to seasons and festival cycles, with fiscal obligations timed to sowing and reaping. Taxation was often in kind, grain, livestock, or labor, and the storage and distribution of these goods required meticulous record-keeping. Fiscal pressure could calm or inflame political tensions. Equitable distribution reinforced loyalty, while perceived injustice bred unrest. Administration and agriculture thus formed a feedback loop where policy had immediate material consequences. Kings cultivated an image that balanced majesty with accessibility. Royal inscriptions emphasized the beneficence of rulers who built canals and restored temples, but they also celebrate martial successes that protected trade and territory. Monumental art and stele broadcast royal narratives into public spaces, turning urban landscapes into instruments of memory. The visual rhetoric of kingship was designed to be seen daily by citizens who would internalize the message of stability and providence. Diplomacy mattered as much as military might. Marriage alliances, treaties, and gift exchanges among rulers created a web of obligations that tied distant polities together. These diplomatic practices were early forms of soft power, where prestige and reciprocity could achieve what force sometimes could not. Ambassadors and trade envoys carried messages and goods that spoke the language of mutual interest. Innovation in metallurgy and craft often arrived hand in hand with shifts in power and wealth distribution. Bronze tools improved agricultural efficiency and military effectiveness, which in turn affected patterns of migration and settlement. Technological advances could rapidly alter the social equilibrium, elevating those who adopted new methods and marginalizing those who clung to older techniques. Progress was rarely uniform, and its benefits were often contested. Religious reform and political ambition sometimes aligned in surprising ways. A king might elevate a particular god to assert control over a region, using theology to justify expansion and taxation. Conversely, priestly resistance could weaken political aims when religious actors mobilized popular sentiment to oppose royal initiatives. The interplay of theology and policy is a reminder that institutions rooted in belief can wield power equal to armies. Lifestyles varied across urban and rural settings, and city dwellers had access to amenities and services absent from the countryside. City artisans could sell wares for long-distance trade, while rural families relied on seasonal labor and communal coordination for irrigation maintenance. Migration between these spheres was common, as opportunities in cities pulled ambitious young people while periodic famines pushed them out. The urban-rural dynamic was a constant source of social tension and renewal. Chronology in Mesopotamia is debated among scholars, but patterns emerge clearly: cycles of centralization and fragmentation, innovation and regression, continuity and disruption. Each epoch built upon the remnants of the previous one, but none simply repeated the same script. People adapted, resisted, syncretized, and created anew, and those processes left material traces in clay and stone that archaeologists and historians continue to decipher. Foreign influences resonated in the architectures and rituals of Mesopotamia. Contacts with Anatolia introduced metalwork techniques, while the movements of Semitic peoples shaped the linguistic landscape. Cultural permeability allowed Mesopotamia to absorb and transform outside elements into its own idioms. Empires were lenses for exchange as much as instruments of control. The legacy of Sumer and Akkad extended far beyond their geographic confines. Later civilizations in the Near East borrowed administrative techniques, legal concepts, and religious motifs that had been honed in Mesopotamia. Writing, initially a tool for accounting and sacred text, became a technology that other cultures adapted and perpetuated. In this way, the achievements of those early city-states did not vanish but rather entered the bloodstream of subsequent civilizations. Archaeological digs unearth objects that reinterpret the melodies of the past: cylinder seals bearing intimate scenes, tablets with school exercises, and small statues intended for household worship. Each find refines our understanding of daily life, governance, and belief. They are fragments of a long conversation between past and present that invites us to imagine the sounds, smells, and textures of those ancient cities. Modern scholars reconstruct the past through careful piecing together of texts, layers of occupation, and comparative anthropology, always aware that certainty is rare and conjecture common. Philology deciphers shifting meanings in words, while archaeology situates those words in spatial and material contexts. Together they create narrations that are provisional but increasingly detailed, allowing us access to human experiences that once seemed irretrievable. To listen for a few hours to this story is to travel through an ancestral landscape where the first experiments in urban life took shape. The narrative of gods, kings, and empires is not merely an account of rulers and monuments, but a portrait of people making sense of weather, fertility, hunger, desire, and community. Their solutions, sometimes pragmatic, sometimes symbolic, created institutions that shaped human history in profound ways. Even in collapse, creativity persisted. New forms of governance and new mythologies arose from the rubble of old orders, and long-standing cultural practices evolved to fit fresh circumstances. Decline was rarely total annihilation. Rather, it was a reshuffling of resources, beliefs, and people into new configurations. The continuity of human expression carried forward echoes of earlier achievements and adapted them for new contexts. Consider the slow endurance of certain myths, like the flood story that resonates across cultures, echoing themes of divine wrath, human hubris, and the hope of renewal. Such stories reveal a shared human repertoire for grappling with catastrophe and survival. They became communal tools, teaching successive generations how to interpret misfortune and how to marshal collective resilience. Kingship transformed as different rulers emphasized different virtues: piety, military genius, architectural patronage, or legal reform. Each leader's emphasis shaped administrative practice and cultural priorities, leaving varied legacies that later historians and kings would emulate or reject. The multiplicity of models allowed later rulers to pick and choose strategies that best fit changing political realities. Ritual, law, and architecture together formed a durable grammar of governance. Temples anchored towns, laws organized economic life, and monuments articulated power. This grammar could be taught, copied, and adapted, ensuring that the techniques of rule refined in Mesopotamia would echo far beyond its borders. The architecture of authority had thus been established early, and its elements remained visible in the political vocabularies of subsequent eras. The interplay of religion and economy continued to fascinate those who study ancient Mesopotamia. Wealth produced piety in the form of temple gifts, and piety structured economic flows through ritual obligations and festival expenditures. This cyclicity reinforced hierarchies while also creating spaces for negotiation and redistribution. Temples, markets, and palaces were partners in an economy that mixed faith with material necessity. Women in these societies navigated power structures in nuanced ways. They served as priestesses, landholders, and business agents, sometimes appearing in administrative documents as guarantors and transaction partners. Their influence was not uniform, and it varied by city, class, and epoch, but it was present and often substantial. Legal texts provide glimpses of matrimonial arrangements, dowries, and property rights that complicate monolithic narratives of gender relations. Children learned skills through apprenticeship and household training, and the process of becoming an adult was both formal and informal. Education beyond basic literacy was often a path to clerical or priestly positions, and those who advanced into scribal ranks could influence policy by virtue of skill. Childhood was rarely a stage of leisure. Labor began early, but so did the instruction that perpetuated institutional memory. Stories about ancestors mattered because lineage anchored land claims and social standing. Genealogies appearing on inscriptions and family lists were not mere vanity, they were legal instruments that established rights. In a world where memory could be fragile, the recorded name became a talisman against dispossession and oblivion. Art and iconography preserved political messages and theological motifs. The lion, the bull, the stylized tree, and the composite demon all carried resonance that transcended localities. Artists and patrons used these motifs to communicate strength, fertility, protection, and divine favor. Such visual languages could be read across borders and centuries by those who knew their codes. Even the humble objects of daily use contributed to stability by creating predictable routines: bread baked according to recipes passed down in families, garments woven with regional patterns, and tools shaped to fit local tasks. These practices rooted communities in shared competence and taste, and they softened the jolts of political change. The everyday, then, was an anchored reality underneath grand narratives of conquest and reform. Times of crisis produced innovations as leaders and communities sought solutions to immediate threats. New irrigation techniques, rearranged taxation schemes, and altered diplomatic postures were all responses to pressures that could no longer be met by existing systems. Adaptive capacity was thus a hallmark of survival, and it required the willingness to experiment and sometimes to fail. Relic survivals from ancient Mesopotamia influenced later legal and literary traditions in ways both direct and oblique. Notions of contract, property, and divine sanction traveled into legal cultures that followed, while literary themes migrated into epic cycles of neighboring peoples. The ripple effects demonstrate that the contributions of Sumer and Akkad were not confined to their era but continued to shape human thought. When archaeologists sift the layers of Tell mounds and read the tablets within, they reconstruct dialogues between rulers and citizens, priests and laypeople, traders and farmers. Those dialogues reveal that even the earliest states grappled with questions that still occupy political thought: how to distribute resources fairly, how to legitimize authority, and how to build institutions that outlast a single life. The past thus becomes a mirror in which we can examine our own perennial challenges. The story of ancient Mesopotamia is not an arc with a tidy beginning and neat ending. It is a braided narrative of innovation and tradition, of people who fashioned cities and gods to make sense of a world of rivers and deserts. Their legacy is less about static monuments and more about the enduring techniques of governance, writing, and cultural transmission that continue to inform human societies. To study them is to listen to a long conversation that stretches across millennia, a voice that teaches how peoples build worlds and how those worlds build them in return. Imagine a river that gives life and takes it away in equal measure, whispering its own ancient litany as it winds through flat, fertile land. That river is the Tigris and that is the Euphrates, and between them rose the cities that would teach the world how to build kingdoms. For centuries, people learned to harness their waterways, to coax wheat from mud and clay, and to shape clay into tablets that preserved law, poetry, and memory. In those acts of making, Babylon and Assyria would become names that echoed across time, not just as places but as ideas of power and order. Begin with Babylon, whose name evokes ramparts and hanging gardens, markets humming with merchants, and temples that aimed for the sky. There was an essential rhythm to life there, dictated by irrigation schedules and religious festivals, by the plodding caravans that carried grain and wool, and by the scribes who wrote the city's memory on wet clay. Babylon was more than a city. It was a symbol, often recreated and reimagined by successive rulers who wanted their reign to be the one through which the city would shine. In every brick and inscription, you can hear the intentions of kings who sought to bend fate to law and architecture. Hammurabi, king of Babylon in the 18th century BCE, wanted his reign to be an instrument of justice as much as of conquest. His law code is the best known of his achievements, famously engraved on a granite stele topped by an image of the king receiving law from a god. When you read the laws, even now, you sense a ruler trying to write social obligations into the very bones of daily life, to standardize expectations about family, wages, property, and punishment. It was a new kind of power, one articulated not only in conquest but in text, intended to bind a diverse population with a shared sense of right and wrong. But the laws themselves were practical as well as symbolic, drawn from a world where contracts were sealed with clay, where obligations were recorded, and where courts were often public. Cases were decided in the presence of witnesses, and scribes were the memory keepers who could make a private agreement become public by fixing it in clay. Law was therefore an administrative tool as much as a moral one, a way of structuring property, inheritance, and labor so that a large city could function. The codification of rules under Hammurabi did not erase custom, it organized it, making power legible and enforceable. From Babylon's focus on law, transition to Assyria's different taste for power, the Assyrians loved the spectacle of domination. Their kings were military men who imagined the world as a chessboard to be ordered through speed, force, and strategy. Assyrian palaces were decorated not only with reliefs of gods and myth, but with vivid scenes of conquest, armies advancing, walls falling, courtiers bringing tribute, designed to intimidate and to record. Theirs was a bureaucratic machine that ran on communication and terror, but it was also sophisticated, connecting distant provinces with roads, relay stations, and detailed records. Yet these two polities shared many practical technologies and cultural forms. Both employed cuneiform writing, the pressing of reed styluses into clay to make wedges that recorded everything from accounts to epic tales. Writing created a common language of administration. It allowed kings to dispatch instructions across hundreds of miles and scribes to compile lists of goods and people, making governance possible on a scale never before seen. Cuneiform was not a simple code, it was a living system of signs that evolved over millennia, adaptable to several languages. In the hands of poets and priests, it became a medium for stories that probed what it meant to be human, as with the Epic of Gilgamesh. That poem, older than many civilizations, retells a hero's journey that questions mortality, friendship, and kingship, offering a voice from the same cradle of civilization that also produced the laws and administrative records. When scholars later unearthed these tablets, they discovered not just bureaucracy but a deep cultural imagination. Architecture in Mesopotamia carried meaning as surely as any inscription. Cities rose around ziggurats, stepped towers that were temples and cosmic symbols, tethering the human to the divine. A ziggurat's earthen core and baked brick facade were intended to lift the priestly rituals closer to the heavens, and each temple complex served as an economic hub where offerings, surplus, and labor were concentrated. The built environment thus reflected religious priorities and economic control at once, tying the city's spiritual claims to its material wealth. Babylon's most famous architectural image is its massive walls and imposing gateways, which suggested both protection and monumental pride. The Ishtar Gate, reconstructed in a modern museum from its glazed bricks, originally led into a processional way lined with reliefs of lions and dragons, symbols mixing royal power, divine protection, and civic identity. Processions along that route were acts of statecraft as much as piety, a choreography of authority in which the king and his god shared center stage. For a visiting dignitary, that spectacle announced the sophistication and might of Babylon. Assyrian architecture, by contrast, often emphasized the palace as the seat of administrative might, with long halls for audience and reliefs that functioned as historical narrative. These scenes were not subtle, they were declarations. They told subjects, neighbors, and vassals that the Assyrian king was capable of subduing cities, capturing kings, and controlling trade routes. Yet within this rhetoric of force, there were also depictions of tribute and diplomacy, moments where negotiation and reward played roles in building an empire as much as fear did. The economy of these states depended on a balance of agriculture, craft production, and trade. The rivers enabled irrigation, and with irrigation came the possibility of surplus, which in turn allowed specialization. Craftspeople produced fine textiles, metalwork, and pottery, merchants exchanged goods across long distances, and palaces stored grain and redistributed it in times of need. Control of irrigation meant control of livelihoods, and both Assyrian and Babylonian states invested heavily in canals, dams, and the organization of seasonal labor. Irrigation itself demanded engineering and planning. Levees had to be built, channels regularly dredged, and seasonal floods predicted and managed. The labor for these tasks was coordinated through local authorities, often under palace oversight, with tax obligations paid in grain or labor. When a canal fell into disrepair, the results could be immediate and catastrophic. Silt would choke fields, yields would fall, and social tensions would rise. This hydraulic reality made governance an exercise in constant maintenance, and it connected the mundane chores of maintenance with the grand narratives of kingship. Religion permeated public and private life, not as a separate sphere but as a lens through which people saw health, justice, and cosmic order. Each city had patron deities whose temples dominated urban walls, and these gods were invoked in treaties, in legal oaths, and in the founding of buildings. The king often acted as both political head and chief religious sponsor, ensuring that the god's favor was on his side. Divine sanction was not merely rhetorical, it was embedded in rituals that included offerings, divination, and the careful observance of omens. Divination itself was a sophisticated art. Scholars and priests read the flights of birds, the entrails of animals, and the patterns of oil on water to infer divine will. Such practices were not superstitious add-ons but part of a rationalized system of prognostication that allowed rulers to justify policy choices. Decisions about war, planting, and diplomacy were often couched in the language of omen and consultation, giving rulers a sacred imprimatur for otherwise political acts. Law and religion frequently intersected in subtle ways. Oaths were sworn before gods, temple property was legally protected, and penal measures were sometimes framed as restoring cosmic balance against disorder. In that sense, law did not stand apart from ritual but was a continuation of it, a social technology that sought to stabilize relationships through sacred accountability. Even when punishments were harsh, they were meant to reintegrate the community into a moral order thought to be anchored in divine command. The kings themselves were central fixtures of this moral architecture. Hammurabi styled himself as a shepherd chosen by the gods to bring justice. Later Babylonian kings adopted similar language, seeing their rule as an extension of divine care. Assyrian kings, while emphasizing their martial prowess, also presented themselves as restorers of order, repairers of temples, and patrons of learning. Kingship was thus an amalgam of military, administrative, and religious responsibilities, each reinforcing the other's legitimacy. Nebuchadnezzar II, a Neo-Babylonian king, is the image many people carry when they think of Babylon, a builder of palaces and perhaps of gardens so lush they were whispered to be suspended in the air. He rebuilt the city's walls and temples after decades of neglect, sought to revive Babylon's grandeur, and left inscriptions that celebrated these achievements. Whether or not every romantic detail of the Hanging Gardens was real, their story reveals the ambition of rulers to blend utility and beauty, to create spaces that would awe subjects and foreigners alike. Nebuchadnezzar's reign dramatized the way architecture became a political language. Assyria's great rulers, like Tiglath-Pileser, Sargon II, and Ashurbanipal, pursued overlapping goals of expansion and consolidation. They built fortresses, reorganized provinces, and invested in administrative sophistication that allowed them to extract tribute and to mobilize armies quickly. Assyrian might relied on mobility, chariots, cavalry, and disciplined infantry units moved with purpose, often supported by engineers who could build siege ramps and battering tools. Military capacity was paired with a postal system of sorts, an ability to communicate orders and reports across vast distances, which made central control plausible. The Assyrian habit of deporting populations was both brutal and effective as a strategy. By moving groups of people out of rebellious regions and resettling them in other parts of the empire, the Assyrians broke down local power structures while also using the new inhabitants as sources of labor and tribute. These deportations created a landscape of ethnic mixing that left its marks in language and custom. While the moral cost was high, from the point of view of imperial management, the policy stabilized volatile zones and redistributed skilled labor where it was needed. Palaces and libraries were mirror institutions of power and knowledge. Ashurbanipal's library in Nineveh contained tens of thousands of tablets, a collection that ranged from administrative records to scientific texts and the myths that bound a culture together. The collection was organized and cataloged, an early archive that reveals a hunger for knowledge as well as an administrative genius. When the library's clay tablets were preserved by the fires that consumed the palace during the city's fall, they became archaeological treasures that would centuries later give modern readers direct access to ancient voices. The when and how of conquest shaped these cities' fortunes. Babylon rose and fell under different dynasties, occasionally subjugated by foreign powers, sometimes thriving under native rule. Assyria expanded to a point where it touched Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt, creating a network of vassal states. Empires were never static. They breathed with war and peace, consolidation and fragmentation. The cycles of rise and fall were also occasions for cultural borrowing, as motifs and technologies flowed from one region to another. Trade routes connected these empires to distant lands, bringing lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, and tin from faraway regions necessary for making bronze. Markets were spaces of negotiation where foreign goods and local tastes mixed, and merchants served as the arteries through which wealth and ideas circulated. Competition for control of routes sometimes provoked conflict, but it also encouraged treaties and diplomatic marriages that wove a complex network of alliances. The economy was thus as much social as material. Trade relied on trust, reputation, and the enforcement of contracts. Diplomacy had a literary as well as practical side. Royal letters, sealed and delivered across vast distances, reveal a web of relations between kings who sometimes called each other brother and sometimes sent threats with equal formality. Treaties were written to last, invoking gods as witnesses and binding parties with oaths that could be enforced by temple authorities. The tone of correspondence could be flattering, curt, or menacing, depending on relative power, but it always reflected an awareness that words could carry weight nearly as lethal as swords. Daily life for common people was shaped by routines and rituals that look familiar across millennia. Families cooked, celebrated births and funerals, and negotiated work and marriage within the constraints of law and custom. Women managed households and engaged in market activities, sometimes owning property and appearing in contracts as sellers or borrowers. The social fabric contained inequality, certainly, but it also contained negotiation, adaptation, and forms of agency that are visible in contracts and letters where ordinary people made claims and struck bargains. Slavery existed as part of the economic order, but it came in many forms and was not always permanent. People might be enslaved as the result of debt, war, or legal punishment, and some could be redeemed or enter into different forms of servitude. The existence of slaves affected labor organization, but many tasks were also performed by free labor and by corvée systems where citizens owed periodic labor to the palace or temple. These variations in status made social relations complex and sometimes porous, offering avenues for mobility as well as exploitation. Artisans were central to the cultural presence of these cities. Their craft created the visible signs of taste and wealth, from cylinder seals carved with intimate scenes to finely worked metal jewelry. Cylinder seals served as signatures, rolled on wet clay to authenticate documents and containers, and they provide vivid glimpses of mythic scenes, courtly life, and even humor. Artisans lived between markets and palaces, producing goods for both daily use and ceremonial display, and their work let us see the textures of ancient life up close. Textiles, for instance, were prized and often described in legal and poetic sources. Weavers produced fabrics that could denote status, and patterns could carry symbolic meanings. Trade in cloth supported entire industries, from shepherds providing wool to dyers who used plant and mineral-based pigments. Clothing was not merely utilitarian, it signified place in the social order and testified to a city's connections, with imported dyes and fibers signaling far-reaching networks of exchange. Religion's narratives were codified in myths that told the story of creation, the gods' battles, and the origins of kingship. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, provides a cosmogony where gods rise and arrange the cosmos, and where a chief god is elevated through victory. Myths like these legitimated temple cults and kingship by situating political order within a cosmic drama. They were recited in rituals and festivals, turning story into communal memory and social glue. Festivals themselves were vital times when city life came together in collective rhythm. During New Year celebrations, for instance, rituals reenacted cosmic renewal, and the king sometimes played a role as the god's agent on earth. Such ceremonies mixed pageantry with piety and could also function as political recalibrations, reaffirming loyalties and the social contract between ruler and ruled. For those in the crowd, festivals were sensory experiences of color, scent, sound, and movement that affirmed communal identity. Language and education were key to maintaining these complex systems. Scribes trained in schools learned to write in strict hands, copying lexical lists and administrative models until their writing became practice and craft. Literacy was specialized but valuable. Scribes could ascend to powerful bureaucratic positions, becoming indispensable to palace and temple. The training itself preserved knowledge across generations, from accounting methods to medical recipes, making scribal culture a backbone of continuity. Medicine and science flourished in pragmatic ways. Physicians mixed empirical observation with therapeutic rituals, compiling recipes and procedures for common ailments. Astronomers tracked celestial movements and developed calendars that allowed states to plan agricultural and ritual life. Far from being isolated, these practices reflected pragmatic attempts to understand and predict the world, combining observation with symbolic interpretation in ways that served both knowledge and power. Timekeeping matters in agrarian states, and the calendars developed by Mesopotamian scholars were sophisticated and practical. Months followed lunar cycles but were adjusted to align with the solar year, a process that required intercalation and careful observation. Festivals and planting seasons depended on this work, and priests often kept the records. The ability to mark time precisely allowed rulers to plan campaigns, festivals, and tax cycles in ways that reinforced administrative control. Literary production also included wisdom literature, letters, and proverbs that traveled through scribal networks. These texts advise on administration, morality, and practical household matters, giving modern readers insight into the mentalities of the ancient world. Wisdom sayings might counsel patience, advocate shrewdness, or offer reflections on human frailty. They reveal a population that reflected on the limits and possibilities of agency, power, and fate. Artistic motifs migrated as empires expanded and contracted, creating a shared vocabulary across different polities. The lion motif, the stylized tree, and composite beasts appear in both Babylonian and Assyrian art, adapted to local tastes. These shared symbols attest to a cultural fluidity where artisans borrowed, imitated, and innovated, ensuring that styles spread across borders even when politics divided them. Visual language became a medium of connection in a fragmenting political landscape. The personal dimension of power appears in letters between family members, merchants, and officials who dealt with everyday crises and joys. A merchant's plea for delayed payment, a mother's request to the king for intervention, or a soldier's description of a campaign bring immediacy to the vast sweep of empires. These documents humanize individuals whose lives otherwise might be subsumed by the scale of monuments and treaties. They are voices that cross millennia to tell us how people coped with hunger, loss, and aspiration. The role of women in these societies was multifaceted and sometimes surprising. Some women managed large estates, ran businesses, and even sponsored temple activity. Queens and royal women could exert influence through patronage and diplomacy, and priestesses maintained significant religious roles. Legal texts show women engaged in legal actions and property transactions, reminding us that gender dynamics were complex and mediated by social status, wealth, and customary rights. The ideas of kingship also carried narrative weight in literature and ritual. Kings were often depicted both as heroic figures and as fallible human beings, subjects of mythic lessons about pride, justice, and transience. Epic narratives and royal inscriptions sometimes blurred, with kings casting themselves in heroic light while myths supplied the symbolic framework for their deeds. This interplay of story and inscription meant that historical memory was constantly being reshaped to suit present needs. Despite their sophistication, these societies were vulnerable to climatic shifts, disease, and violent upheaval. A prolonged drought or epidemic could undermine agricultural production and weaken political authority. Such stresses hastened migrations, triggered rebellions, and sometimes precipitated the fall of long-standing regimes. Environmental factors remind us that human projects rely on fragile balances and that imperial resilience is always contingent. When foreign armies finally toppled great centers, their ruins were not immediate blanks but fertile grounds for memory and myth. The destruction of a palace or temple created opportunities for new rulers to claim legitimacy by rebuilding. Conquerors often repurposed the monuments of their predecessors, inscribing their names on old bricks and continuing the ritual life of a city even as they changed its political color. Ruin and reuse thus became part of the long-term cultural palimpsest of Mesopotamia. Archaeology has been the modern force that transformed ruins into stories. Excavations that began in the 19th century uncovered tablets, reliefs, and foundations that allowed scholars to reconstruct narratives once thought lost. The work of deciphering cuneiform opened up whole worlds of law, poetry, and administration, but it also raised ethical questions about the removal and storage of materials. Museums and archives now house treasures that once belonged to living communities, and the stories they tell are complicated by their modern journeys. The rediscovery of these civilizations changed how modern societies think about law and history. The Code of Hammurabi, for example, became a symbol in debates about justice and the origins of legal thought. Scholars traced continuities between ancient and later legal systems, finding echoes in later codes and in ethical thinking across the Near East. These connections showed how ideas of justice have long histories and how ancient attempts to order society have reproducible effects across ages. Mesopotamian influence extended into neighboring cultures through trade, diplomacy, and conquest. Near Eastern myths shaped later mythologies, legal ideas influenced subsequent legislative traditions, and administrative techniques were adapted by emergent states. Even biblical narratives carried imprints of Mesopotamian history and myth, as exiles and cultural interactions brought stories and practices into new contexts. The cross-pollination of ideas demonstrates the permeability of cultural boundaries in antiquity. The transmission of knowledge was not always linear. Texts could be copied, reinterpreted, or lost, rituals changed as community needs shifted, and kings curated the past according to contemporary priorities. Libraries like Ashurbanipal's preserved one moment in a living tradition, but even those collections were selective, reflecting tastes, interests, and administrative requirements. Over time, what was remembered and what was forgotten were shaped by politics, chance, and the accidents of preservation. The emotional life of cities can be felt in the way monuments were designed to inspire awe and a sense of order. A visitor standing on a palace terrace might take in the horizon of mud brick houses, the river's glide, and the line of procession along a paved way. Such experiences were orchestrated to bind bodies into a political sentiment. They were attempts to awe and to comfort, to reassure inhabitants that the city's greatness was a stable good. Architecture, then, performed psychology as much as it performed politics. Military innovations included not only tactics but logistical marvels. Armies needed supply lines and forage, and the ability to maintain extended campaigns was a mark of organizational depth. Siegecraft improved with engineers who designed ramps and battering devices, and the capture of a city often involved negotiation as much as brute force. The capture and reorganization of urban centers required administrators who could incorporate new populations, redirect resources, and impose fiscal systems. Fiscal systems themselves were intricate. Taxes could be levied in kind or in money, and the palace maintained granaries and treasuries. Accounting practices used standardized tablets listing goods, people, and transactions, allowing central authorities to monitor resources. The state was a ledger as much as a set of armies and temples. To rule was to keep continuous account, to forecast supply and demand, and to plan for scarcity as well as abundance. Religious plurality marked the landscape, with many gods often seen as regional manifestations of broader divine archetypes. A deity such as Ishtar could appear with different emphases in various cities, sometimes as a fertility goddess, sometimes as a patron of war and sexuality. This theological flexibility allowed religion to adapt to political needs and facilitated the absorption of patrons when cities changed rulership. It also meant that piety was a living process, constantly negotiated and performed. Art and iconography recorded both continuity and innovation, with motifs reworked across generations. Sculptors and relief carvers preserved details of daily dress, weaponry, and cultic objects, giving modern observers precise glimpses of ancient technologies and habits. Inscriptions often explained scenes, but the images themselves conveyed an immediacy that text sometimes lacked. Together, word and image created durable narratives of authority and identity. The practice of inscription was itself performative. When a king had his name stamped on a wall or placed on a foundation deposit, he was not only recording a fact but shaping how later generations would interpret his reign. These acts of inscription attempted to fix a narrative in place, to ensure that memory would travel in a favorable direction. In a sense, every inscription was an ancient form of propaganda, calibrated to last beyond the life of the author. Religious professionals were both guardians of knowledge and instruments of social cohesion. Priests managed temple estates, performed rituals, and educated young scribes. The temple was an economic center as well as a spiritual one, controlling lands, craft production, and distribution networks. This dual role made temples indispensable to urban life, anchoring communities through economic and ritual obligations. Music and poetry enriched ritual and daily life. Lyres, drums, and pipes accompanied chants and recitations, turning text into communal performance. Poetic meters and formulaic phrases helped preserve songs and prayers across generations, allowing communities to rehearse their identities. These auditory traditions made memory not only readable but hearable, embedding culture within the rhythms of sound. The integration of foreign elements into courtly culture was often deliberate and pragmatic. Imported craftsmen were commissioned for special works, and foreign captives sometimes contributed their skills to local industries. Cultural borrowing was a strategy as much as an aesthetic choice, a means by which rulers signaled cosmopolitan power while satisfying practical needs for specialized craft. Such exchanges created hybrid styles that became identifiers of particular eras. The legal imagination extended beyond punishment to include welfare and regulation. Laws governed marriage, inheritance, and debt, but they also sought to regulate market behavior and to provide recourse for injury and theft. In some instances, rulers issued proclamations that reduced debt burdens or restored confiscated lands to win popular favor. These acts suggest that kingship involved both coercion and concession, an interplay of force and care. The ritualized humiliation of enemies was a political strategy for reinforcing dominance. Captured leaders might be displayed, paraded, or recorded in humiliating postures and reliefs to warn would-be rebels. Such representations ensured that stories of conquest circulated widely and visibly, turning defeat into a spectacle that strengthened the victor's legitimacy. While brutal, These displays were calculated communications meant to shape perceptions of power. Mentalities about the cosmos influenced everyday decisions, from planting dates to war timings. Astrology and omen reading provided frameworks for making risky decisions seem less arbitrary, and rulers sought the counsel of experts in these esoteric arts. Such consultations allowed a veneer of divine insight to justify strategic choices, weaving religious authority into the fabric of statecraft. In that way, celestial movements could be as politically consequential as troop deployments. The fragmentation of power in the later millennia led to new centers and new languages rising from the same ancient soil. Aramaic, for example, spread as a lingua franca, enabling communication across diverse populations and easing administrative burdens. Language shift did not erase older systems but layered them, creating multicultural mosaics in which older scripts and newer tongues coexisted. The adaptability of institutions and people shaped the region's long-term resilience. Historiography of Mesopotamia has changed with each generation of scholars and excavators. Early narratives focused on monumental kings and spectacular conquests, but later work emphasized everyday people and economic structures. Methodologies evolved, and new techniques such as digital epigraphy and remote sensing added precision to archaeological interpretation. The changing face of scholarship reflects not only new data but new questions about power, identity, and the agency of non-elites. The legacy of these civilizations is not confined to museums and academic books. It appears in legal ideas, literary motifs, and even in the architecture of modern imagination. Concepts such as codified law and bureaucratic administration have deep antecedents in Mesopotamian practice, showing continuity in the human effort to order collective life. The stories and images excavated from ancient cities continue to inform how we imagine governance, justice, and the relationship between the human and the divine. Revisiting these pasts invites humility and wonder. The people who built Babylon and Assyria were not primitives but sophisticated actors working with limited tools and vast ingenuity. Their achievements in law, writing, and urban life were impressive responses to environmental and social challenges. When we read their laws, their myths, and their administrative tablets, we confront minds very like our own, grappling with power, mortality, and the desire to leave a mark. The archaeology of memory shows physical traces and silences alike. Some streets and palaces persist in earth and brick, while entire neighborhoods vanish under layers of build-up and weather. The fragments we possess are partial but evocative, inviting reconstruction through imagination guided by evidence. Each shard of pottery, each cracked tablet, is a fragment of a life that once moved through those streets, offering a point of contact across time. Modern cities overlay ancient ones like palimpsests, with patterns of settlement following the old advantages of water, arable land, and trade corridors. In this continuity, the ancient world exerts a slow pressure on contemporary landscapes, seeding place names, agricultural practices, and even legal conventions. The past is not a closed book but a continuing influence that shapes how living communities imagine themselves. That living past is part of why Babylon and Assyria persist in our cultural memory. To listen to these histories is to hear a chorus of voices, kings issuing proclamations, scribes recording accounts, artisans carving images, priests offering prayers, farmers groaning under dust and rain. The density of those voices creates a sense of a world alive with negotiation and creation. Each voice contributes to a larger conversation about how human societies organize themselves when land, water, and imagination combine. The endurance of certain texts gives us unlikely intimacy with ancient thought. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for instance, has passages that probe friendship, loss, and the search for immortality in a way that feels startlingly modern. When you hear that poem read aloud, the emotional timbre connects the listener to concerns that transcend era. It reminds us that beneath political structures and legal systems lie human hearts facing the same existential questions we do. Material culture also tells stories of taste and mobility. Beads and seals, styles of pottery, and remnants of dietary remains sketch outlines of consumption and preference. These material traces suggest not only the existence of trade routes but also of networks of social signaling in which possessions indicated status and identity. Objects thus function as social language, encoded with values and stories of origin that people read and recited in daily life. The breakdown of empires did not erase their cultural achievements. Rather, these achievements were dispersed, adapted, and sometimes transformed by new cultures. Elements of Babylonian law and Assyrian administration reappeared in later polities, sometimes altered to fit new contexts. This process demonstrates how institutions migrate, reconfigure, and continue to shape societies, even change inevitable. For the modern listener, there is a moral complexity in these tales of power. Kings built and destroyed, priests healed and judged, scribes recorded and sometimes lied, and ordinary people navigated these structures in ways that could be both resilient and tragic. The story of Babylon and Assyria is not a simple parable of progress or of decline, but a layered narrative in which power and culture intertwine in both creative and devastating ways. Archaeological practice also raises contemporary ethical debates about stewardship, provenance, and the rights of nations to their heritage. The movement of artifacts into museums far from their original contexts opened up questions about representation and restitution. As scholarship advances, so too does a global conversation about who tells these ancient stories and how those stories should be stewarded and shared. That conversation reshapes how future generations will access and interpret the past. The image of the ruler walking among ziggurats and gardens is not a fossilized snapshot, but a repeated motif that rulers revived and reshaped to suit their purposes. Whether through conquest or cultivation, kings sought continuity with a past that legitimized their present. This appeal to antiquity was political, spiritual, and rhetorical, enabling rulers to stand in a lineage of tradition even as they innovated. It reminds us that memory is a resource that leaders mobilize to anchor authority. Consider the diplomatic bazaars where envoys changed gifts and gossip, where rumor and information flowed as surely as silver and textiles. These spaces permitted negotiation outside formal treaties and often produced more flexible arrangements than public declarations. The informal channels of diplomacy mattered because they allowed personal relationships to smooth over the rough edges of interstate rivalry. Such human exchanges diluted the absolutism of royal rhetoric and introduced nuance into international relations. Education in scribal houses prepared future administrators and intellectuals, instilling discipline, memory, and a sense of cultural continuity. Students learned by copying model texts, often starting with lists and proverbs and moving toward complex administrative templates and literary works. This apprenticeship produced a class of competent professionals who could manage texts and affairs with precision, forming a backbone for empire and city alike. Scribes thus formed the connective tissue between the private house and the royal archive. The psychological effect of monumental imagery should not be underestimated. Reliefs of kings defeating enemies functioned as repeated visual narratives to train viewers into a particular understanding of order and submission. These images, encountered routinely in palaces and public spaces, normalized the idea of the king's exceptional capacity and the futility of resistance. The power of repeated visual rhetoric operates subtly, shaping consent over the course of years rather than through immediate coercion alone. Power and culture in Mesopotamia were not static formulas but evolving bricolage responding to immediate needs and long-term strategies. New kings borrowed or repudiated predecessors' policies depending on circumstances, priests adapted rites to new circumstances, artisans mixed styles to produce new tastes. This adaptability is part of why the region remained central for millennia, able to weather political change while preserving and transforming cultural forms. The end of these empires did not signal an end of their ideas. Concepts of justice, administrative practice, and literary motifs circulated into successor states and informed the broader historical trajectory of the Near East. These cultural afterlives form a testament to the resilience of certain institutions and ideas. They also highlight the deep interconnection between material practice and intellectual innovation in shaping human societies. Finally, to think of Babylon and Assyria is to imagine a landscape of sun-baked bricks, bustling markets, sacred processions, and the tireless work of scribes. It is to hear the measured tapping of a stylus on clay and the rumble of caravans crossing dusty plains. Those sensory details bring the ancient world close, turning names on a page into lived experience. In that experience we find not only the roots of law and administration but the enduring humanity of people who, like us, sought meaning, order, and beauty in a changing world. There are still places to be excavated, archives to be digitized, and debates to be engaged with rigor and humility, because each new discovery refines our picture in unpredictable ways. The archaeologist's trowel and the scholar's careful translation are tools of connection, and modern technologies can amplify them without replacing the patient work of context and interpretation. In that continuing work lies a profound duty, to preserve and understand a shared human heritage, and to ensure that the voices rising from the clay find listeners today and tomorrow.